Interpolation. That's a weird fucking way to say it.
Interpret.
Interpolation.
Inline string formatting. That's what it is to me.
Formatting. Yeah.
It just seems like it reduces some code. But it is
Expression
definitely weird to
bodied
look
members. For some reason, whenever I read expression bodied members, I think of big booty hoes.
at. So yeah. So while you were away, I was saying that I've actually have someone who's using this a lot now. And the really frustrating part is they've lined everything up. So on the left, you have the Web API declaration. Then a little further over, you have the method name. A little further over, you have the Lambda, the arrow function. And a little further over, you then have the actual code.
Yeah.
So you're scrolling back and forth. It's like, why do I keep scrolling?
It's funny because I'm all about keeping code on the left.
Yeah.
It's
This is the first time I really ever seen someone do it to this degree.
Yeah.
I've seen people do it with variable names and things, and it's
Yeah,
there.
it looks nice, but it's like very difficult to keep up.
right.
And when
That's what happened is that back in the day, like, so I actually switched over, like way back in the day. If you want to go back to like Pascal or C days and stuff, I used to do that. You know why? Because we used to print our source code out a lot more.
Yeah.
And then those
We're
days
not
are
that
over. Those days are long gone. So now I'm like all about keeping code on the left if I can.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, are we gonna hit record here?
Well, first that would mean
Good.
that I had Audacity on. That would be pretty important. Do I need that? Do I need Audacity?
Big booty hoes.
Yeah, Audacity might be necessary to actually record.
All right, let's see.
I finished my alcoholic beverage a while ago.
Let me make sure that I'm recording here. Test recording. Looks like I'm recording okay. Everything's good. Let's check the gain back here.
I should probably test that too.
I'm here.
Testing
I
one,
can
two,
see
three.
myself.
Testing one, two,
Myself
three.
talking, and I actually, you know what I need to do? I need to turn off that computer still too, because when I've forgotten to turn off that computer, we've gotten a hiss.
Big booty hoes.
You're gonna be cutting that from the thing. I can tell you that now.
Years ago, my wife was a
Big booty hoe.
she was advising a mock trial team,
Okay.
and so the guy was practicing his opening, and he was this really good smooth speaker. And don't ask me, like this, so you got to figure they've been doing this all year long. He's probably given it a million times. He has it memorized backwards and forwards. And so we're sitting here at the, this is going to be the state final, right? It's going to be on, the team made the state final where they're going to be at the courthouse in Harrisburg in front of a real judge and big audience on public television, all that stuff. And he's sitting in the hall just going over his opening. And he thinks it's funny to say, instead of saying the prosecution, it's like, Your Honor, the prostitution. And he's like cracking up. And then finally one of the other kids on the team says, You'd better stop it because you're going to say it now.
You're gonna do it.
And man, if you watch the video really, really closely, you can see that he like smirks a little bit because he is himself.
Uh-huh.
But then they won anyway, so who cares?
Well, that'd be even better if he did say it.
Yeah, he's like, the
Pass it off.
prostitution.
The prostitution rests.
I mean, yeah,
No, just plays it off. Your Honor, prostitution rests.
prostitution rests, Your Honor.
Our work is done. It's time for rest.
Speaking of prosecution, have you been watching Daredevil season 2?
No, I haven't.
I don't really. I like season 1. I don't like all the supernatural shit. Anyway, we should probably start recording.
What's supernatural shit? Come on. Spiller, aren't you? Have you finished watching the whole season?
Have I? No.
Yes.
I don't know
Okay.
what episode. I'm very far in. I don't know what episode.
It's just funny you mentioned that, so
Yeah.
keep watching.
You're finished?
Yeah.
I watched where Electra goes to fight Stick. I haven't seen that yet.
Oh, that's like episode 10, I think.
Yeah, I'm very far in.
Hangout. When you do this hangout thing, don't you get we've had this discussion before, don't you get a non-join the hangout link?
All right, I'm going to start recording, okay, son?
Yeah. I got to give it to you, though, for some
Right.
stupid freaking reason.
Ryan.
I could at least we could tweet it. Static Void Podcast could tweet it.
Yeah, I guess so. I never bothered doing that at 12 o'clock at night on Sunday, but I could. It could happen. Twitter.com. On the Twitters. Log in
Dang it, am I
as
not
the
logged
Static
in?
Void, please.
I'm not logged in on any freaking
Your keyboard's up.
deal.
Alright, I'm back.
All right, we're just about there.
Cat, are you ready?
Was the cat actually ready?
She lifted her head. Surprised in all our recordings you haven't heard her getting annoyed. When she gets
I
annoyed, she
heard her a
knocks
couple times.
everything. You heard her knocking books down or her food down? That's always
No,
fun.
maybe once.
Then the dogs go get the food, and I'm like, oh, damn, I have to clean the dog food.
It's goddamn zoo over there.
Oh, yes, pretty much is.
All
Those
right.
when there were 18 teenagers there.
Mm. All right, we good?
Oh, this is the link.
We good? What if I
I think so. Let's record and have fun.
Let's
Sure, we're going to be a
record and
little,
have
little rusty.
Yeah, right? How does this Audacity work? What?
Odyssey.
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 Odyssey. Odyssey.
So Medicity, where I work.
Yeah.
Do you use Audacity? I don't.
No, but
You
somebody.
should.
We were at this. It was like an all hands thing, and
By the
This
way, you
guy
know
was-
we're recording.
I know,
right?
yeah, but that's okay.
Okay, I'm broadcasting.
But we're not recording Audacity. Which
No,
is-
we're not recording on Audacity.
I'm not so worried about this. But it was funny. There was this guy who didn't work for the company at all. He was just some security guard or whatever who was ushering people into a meeting room, going Medicity, Medicity this way. And I was like, Medicity. I guess it makes sense when you look at it. Medicity. Audacity. All right.
All
Yeah.
right.
Phonics.
All right. All right. Let's go to Audacity. Hit record. All right. Ready?
Yep.
3, 2, 1, go. Hello, and welcome to the Static Void Podcast. I'm Jess Chadwick,
I'm Todd Snyder.
And I'm Chris Gomez.
and we are your hosts. We're recording this on the evening of March 27th, 2016, and in this episode, we are going to be talking about the latest version of C#, C# 6. Before we get into that, though, I wanted to take a minute just to kind of talk about one of the things that I've been working on. I've actually released a free TypeScript book on LeanPub, and LeanPub's model is pretty cool. It actually allows you to write a book in Markdown and then publish to PDF and EPUB and everything automatically, and then let people download the published book for free, but also allow people who really, really want to give you money to do that too.
Yeah.
So it's been really cool. So the
looked
book is
cool.
called Essential TypeScript, and if you want to check it out, you can go to leanpub.com/essential TypeScript, and if you want to give me money, you can do that too, or you can just decide to, quote, buy the book for free.
It was pretty neat. I was pretty
yeah.
impressed with LeanPub. I mean, they didn't give us anything to say that.
No,
You just said,
no,
right. This is,
I published here, and I was really impressed with it.
It was,
I literally Googled like
defined
write a
and-
book in Markdown or something like that.
Yeah,
and
right.
LeanPub came out, and it's been awesome. It's been
Yeah.
awesome. You just check into GitHub, you check in your Markdown files into GitHub, and they have the whole commit hooks and everything, and it automatically goes and grabs the latest, creates a PDF. It's pretty awesome.
Yeah, definitely. It sounds like it's very easy to work with.
Yeah, yeah,
Having written the book before, sometimes it's challenging to
yeah. Well,
work
they were
directly with editors and things.
Yeah, they were talking about some people use it to basically like take all their blog posts and turn them into like a compilation, which obviously isn't like really as thought out or whatever as a book, but like getting your ideas just into a book, into a PDF that people can kind of easily move around rather than kind of clicking through blog posts. It's a pretty interesting idea.
There was someone who once did that. I'm not going to mention his name. But no, he published a bunch of blog posts, and after a while, he decided to make 2 books. Were kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
commentary to the blog post, but it was interesting that somewhat you could take blog post and actually make it into a book people wanted to buy.
Yeah.
So,
So it's a pretty cool approach. So now let's getting back to C# 6 here. So when we first started the podcast, we all kind of agreed, the three of us kind of agreed that we would do whatever we could to avoid discussing code on the show. Like avoiding saying things like, using open parentheses var file equals file.open, open parentheses file name, close, but right? Like people just would not be able to follow along with that. And so that rule is still definitely in effect. But in this episode, we're going to be just like stepping right up to that line. And so I really hope that we don't go over it. But, with that disclaimer in place, we can jump right into it. We'll get started talking about C# 6.
we'll wrap our stuff with a try-catch block in case we go too far. We'll catch ourselves.
We'll just unwind it, right?
We can throw in a weight into the finally, right?
Exactly.
So we already
Chris,
did it.
I think that you came up with like just a list of everything, right? You want to just like run through that real quick, and then we can kind of circle back and get into each of them.
Yeah. So the first thing about C# 6 is I think it really was kind of the first release built on the Roslyn platform, which Microsoft, they talked about that for years, that we're rewriting the compiler and we're rewriting it in C#, and it's going to be awesome. And it's also, they were working really hard on it being programmable, without really getting into the details with an API, and it's enabled a lot of features in the IDE and stuff. So I feel like that was the first and foremost big feature. But when you talk about the features of the language, there's a fairly, the list that we've got here is just under 10, I think. I'll name a couple of them, like the null conditional, the auto property initializers, the using static feature, string interpolation, expression bodied members. But it might be easier just to go through them a little bit. Some of them we probably won't spend very much time on. But even like, how do you use it, right? Because we, just before the show, we started talking about, hey, what do you have to use C# 6? And
that's my big question.
Yeah, right. And we did a little research into that, because during all of the previews and the betas and everything, they said, just fire up Visual Studio 2013 and go get some, a preview and some NuGet packages, and you're good to go. But it turns out that's not it for today. That's not it for production. So
what is it? So in our research, I had found references to a NuGet package, right? I think I closed it now. Microsoft.net.compilers, I think. We can add a link to it in the show notes. But this apparently, it allows you to, I haven't used it, but this apparently allows you to, it hooks into your build chain to actually allow you to use Roslyn and build your project, build the code, but as you write the code in Visual Studio 2013, you won't get the IntelliSense. You won't get the IntelliSense, and Visual Studio won't know about it, so it'll give you these like red squigglies, and it'll show you syntax errors, even though when you compiled it, everything will be fine. And honestly, for some people that might be good. For some people, I guess, who want to like live on the bleeding edge or something, but I don't know. For me, part of the experience, most of the experience, is the compiler, right? I mean the integration with Visual Studio and the IntelliSense and everything. So if I don't have that, I think that might be a deal breaker for me.
Yeah, it would certainly be for me too. I wouldn't even see the value in trying to do. There's not much stuff here there's nothing here that says like I got to use this tomorrow. It's all interesting, but it's definitely not like going to totally change how I write code. So I definitely think you hinder yourself more than anything else.
Yeah,
so
right.
Another good thing that it's probably been having a hard time figuring out is with every version of C#, usually there's a new version of Visual Studio, right? There's also a new version of .NET. So is this only tied to .NET 4.6, or does it compile down? Can I run it in 4.5 or whatever? What version of .NET am I tied to?
I think it works on the .NET 4 compiler platform, because a lot of this is syntactic sugar, which is actually the same thing that happened in C#5 as well. I mean, C#5's big claim to fame, and there's more features than this in C#5, but the big claim to fame was async await. That was,
Yeah.
That was like the show. That was what they kept talking about at all the conferences, and when they released it, they said you've got to learn to do this asynchronous programming with the async and await keywords, and so it's like C#6 doesn't have the pizzazz feature, I think, that, for instance, previously there was like generics, and then another time it was link, and then another time it was dynamic, and
Yeah.
Link and Lambda and everything else. Yeah, those were
and
definitely.
this time I think it's Roslyn, to be honest. I feel like we've delivered Roslyn, and as we, because part of what we did when we delivered Roslyn, and I'm speaking as if like I'm pretending to be Microsoft here, was we delivered now a feature of the language that, we've got this whole API that you can basically analyze your code, and you can even pluck out statements, and you can start writing like analyzers that'll light up light bulbs in the IDE. It was kind of like even giving you this sort of ReSharper-ish developer experience, and even talking about how your own teams could have their own analyzers, maybe to enforce your own style. And probably what happened was, in order to prove out those features, they said, well, let's implement some stuff in the language. And but some of it is kind of useful. Like, let's start off with a pretty, this is one that I usually see come up pretty early. It's really straightforward. It's just the null conditional access operator, and what it's used for is when you are quote unquote dotting into an object, where you've got some object, like even if you just have a string, and you're going to call a method on it. Well, what would happen if that string was null?
The dreaded null exception.
Right. We did a whole show on that too, right? So the dreaded.
Yeah, we did do a whole thing on null exception.
So the idea was we're always writing code saying like, well, I took a string into this function, so the first thing I got to do is have some guard code at the top, unless you're using some other fancy feature, to make sure it's not null, and then I'll go ahead and call this stuff. And so there's an operator, and it's the question mark dot. So instead of just, like if the string was, the identifier name was value, instead of like value dot and then some method on it, you'd say value question mark dot, and you can do that repeatedly if you're maybe calling a property on a property on a property. You can continue doing that repeatedly, and what it does is it kind of just protects you from the null reference exceptions by not actually trying to dot into the property or field if the parent was null.
So basically, the first field or first property that it discovers or comes across in that whole dot chain that's null, it just returns null for the whole expression. Is that the end result?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, or what you could do is you can combine it with the null coalescing, the two question marks, and maybe return some other value.
Yep.
But that's it, right? And so on stage I saw the Microsoft folks calling it the Elvis operator, and so that name stuck in my head. I thought there were some other good ones though when we were talking about this.
Yeah, I was referring to it as the Riddler operator.
Yeah, I thought that was pretty good. I did.
So it's funny, the way you just described it made this. When I first heard about this, and I've actually seen some people writing code like this, it was a little hard to follow. It was like, what is this thing? All right, so this is probably null, so don't do this. And just the way the style, the way the guy was writing it, I found it kind of a hindrance to do it this way. But when you just described it, that you can go down 3 or 4 layers, it seemed like it made more sense to something you'd want to use.
Yeah.
Something like a lambda expression. We may have a where clause, or all right, where. So if this returns a good operator, now do this. It's kind of interesting. I think it's definitely something. It kind of really feels like all this is syntactic sugar, right? That seems to be the magic word now in the Microsoft world. When we talked about TypeScript before, all this syntactic sugar, which I think is good. I mean, anytime we can make developers' lives easier, so with something like this, with the null operator, I mean, I've got tired for years of writing if string is null, if string is empty. It was so nice when they added the if null is empty.
I actually was looking through some code in just not just on the job, but also in repositories, and sometimes you see like some really diligent developers are taking the discipline at the beginning of every method to be like, well, let me run through the stuff in this method that I don't expect to be null.
Yeah, what could possibly happen?
And then let me also check if this property on it is null, and if its property is null.
Yep.
And I imagine that in the past the three of us might have complained about like, well, if you're having to dot into it that much, consider your design. But forget that. Put that aside.
Regardless.
You got to do it anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one interesting caveat to this operator that might slip by people is that you may think like, wow, this is pretty cool. Could I use it to assign? Like if I had a contact that maybe had first name, last name, address, fields on it, could I say contact question dot last name and then assign it? Like that would be great if it's but that doesn't actually kind of really make any sense. So you can't do that. It will actually be an error that the IDE will say like, what are you trying to do? You can't use this on the left hand side.
A compile time error.
Yeah, you can't even compile. So
yeah, we mentioned this in the null episode. We mentioned this because I mentioned that I have speaking back to the syntactic sugar comment. Like I have a method right now. I have an extension method on top of every object that I call with, but basically says, and it takes advantage of the fact that you can put an extension method on top of a null object, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you call that extension method and you say contact dot with, if that extension object respects the fact that contact instance could actually be null, then that's perfectly legitimate. It compiles fine and it runs just fine, even though it looks kind of weird. It looks like it should be a null reference exception. It takes advantage of that, and then the first line is, if the value that is getting passed in, if the value of this object that I'm extending with my extension method is null, then return that default value or return null or whatever. And so I've gotten around this, and I've been able to take those 20 lines of if-else code down to basically one line, one long line. The line can get pretty long, but I just split it out into multiple lines, but it's still one line of continuous code, and say, contact.with, and then in there you use a little lambda expression, say x.lastname or something like that, contact.lastname or whatever. And it's the same effect, but it's still verbose. Like even if you do it that way, that you might consider syntactic sugar. It's more of an extension method than actually syntax, but it's a little bit closer. But here, this condenses it down so much more that it's really it's quite nice. My only fear with this thing is that you might not notice it, that you're doing it. I'm not really sure there's much of a downside of that though, right? So if you come into my code, if I use this no conditional operator and to escape something that is possibly null, and then you come into my code and you don't realize that's happening, what's the worst that can happen, right? I'm guarding you against a null.
I look at it as a trade-off. Like I said, I've actually seen some developers starting to do this, and the hardest part I had was they were chaining a bunch of methods, so I was trying to learn the code that was going on. So this question mark made it a little hard to follow what was going on until you got the gist of what it was doing. So I think it's a trade-off, right? I mean, having all those extra lines of code can also get a hindrance. But I think if you start, what Chris said before, if you start going down 3, 4, 5 levels, then you probably still have a design problem you need to fix, right? Or some kind of code smell.
This doesn't fix your design.
No.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be a Band-Aid either. So like I said, if you have that layer, that's so many levels of things, then it's something to consider. Because ultimately, you need to deal with the null, right? Even though you're returning null, somewhere else up the chain, sooner or later, null usually means something isn't in the right condition, or if it's coming from the database, it's just empty, right? So you got to be careful with it. It's like anything else, right? In moderation, it's the right solution, but if you overuse it, it can become worse. Make the code harder to read. Because ultimately, that's what all this stuff is about, right? Making code easier to read, easier to follow, writing less lines of code.
Yeah. So here's an easy one. There's the next feature we'll look at is real simple. It's basically an easier way to use static methods. So if you wanted to use console.writeLine, you always have to type console.writeLine. There's nothing you can do to just type writeLine. And it's because writeLine is a static method on the console object. So now we have this ability to say up in your using section where you're doing you're bringing in all the namespaces that you don't want to type. You can say using static system.console in this example, and then now in your code you could just write writeLine, and you would be able to now just keep going in your head to anything else that before was a static method that you always had to identify the parent class of. you could pull that code out, and that's it. That's the end of that feature. I don't know about that.
Yeah, this one really kind of troubles me. I can see. I mean, in effect, you're doing the same thing as you're doing with namespaces, right? So rather than typing out the full namespace of like a class, you make one using statement and you just say here, system.io dot blah 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 dot blah blah blah, right? And so you don't have to type that whole thing in every time, and now you're just bringing all of those items, all of those classes and enums and everything declared in that namespace into the current scope. So you can access them without the full namespace. So that's the same thing that's happening here, but it's going the next level. And like WriteLine is attached to console kind of for a reason, and it has some kind of context, right?
It has a meaning to it.
Yeah, it has a meaning. The context is that it's happening off of the console object, right? It's not an actual object. It's not an instance of an object. It's a class. But it's related to the concept of object orientation, right? So it's attached to this thing. So to bring this function and just kind of arbitrarily put it in the global scope, it kind of makes it weird. Maybe it's just because I don't have a whole lot of experience in functional programming. Maybe it would feel a lot more comfortable if I did have that background. But I don't know. I feel like I'm a little bit of context here.
What if it was in the language from the beginning? Would it be weird?
Yeah, it's a great question.
Well,
that's what I'm not sure about.
So I thought of a couple of things. One is when you just brought up, Jess, about console.WriteLine. So I wonder if you could use this with something like HTTP context. Could you make HTTP context to a static? Because that's a static, right?
And then say
then you'd have current.get request. That would get even more confusing.
Yeah.
Then you're kind of applying what is current, right?
Yeah.
The other thing I thought of is, and trying to remember, I definitely think I've used this a long time ago. You used to be able to alias namespaces. You used to be able to go like using f equals da whatever.
Yeah,
it kind of feels like a substitution for that.
Yeah. Well, but you couldn't alias the actual class, though. I mean, you could alias the class, but you couldn't.
It'd still have to be something referred to. Like even if you alias the C.
Yeah, you have to then use your alias.
C.WriteLine.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. That's how you would do this previous to C#6. Is you would say using C equals system.console, and then you say C.WriteLine.
But the problem with that is the same problem. It becomes another level of abstraction. It doesn't make any sense unless you call it console, and then it's like, well, what's the purpose of doing this?
Yeah. What's the point?
So it's funny. It's like I definitely think this is one of the things that I would use least. I think it would definitely add more confusion than it does.
Well, so I just have a hatred, despite the name of this podcast. I have a hatred of static across the board. Like I do everything I can to avoid the keyword static.
We named the podcast for a reason because we hate static void.
Yeah, the void of static. Yeah.
There should only ever be one static, and that's static main. And that's only because we're stuck with that.
Yep.
Can't get around that.
Yeah, so here's another pretty simple one, just the auto property initializers, which they're designed to say, we've had auto properties for a while, where instead of in the past, like if you go to the early days of .NET,
I remember.
You'd create a property, a getter and a setter, and the only code in the getter and the setter would be to set and retrieve values from a backing variable, some private backing variable. And so it was like this big deal when we got auto properties where we could just say get set. And then I don't actually think it was that long before a lot of us started to say like, oh, but I wanted the backing variable because I don't get immutability if I just throw get set. But whatever, putting that aside.
Or I just wanted to have that one line of like logging code or something. It didn't really do anything. It was just one line of code.
Right. But auto property initializers are just simply you declare a getter, you could declare a getter, and then you follow it up with equals, and then what you actually want to set it to. So this takes the place of maybe a read-only backing variable, where you might have said, I want this immutable property, but what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to make some kind of read-only and either initialize it on the spot or initialize it through the constructor. Those were your options. Yeah. So you can get some immutability that way if you said, because get private set doesn't get you there. Anyone else can come to your class or struct later and use the private setter.
Right, but then also even worse, the thing that has always annoyed me is that you now have to initialize that, even if you did that, the private set, you would have to initialize it on another line. First of all, you wouldn't get that. You can't add the read-only, right? You can't say read-only private set.
Yep.
can only say private, which encapsulates it to your class, but you're able to access it in other places in your class and reassign it. But if you really truly want that immutable read-only instance, the only way to do that is with a backing.
You had to give up auto properties, basically.
But even ignoring the read-only part,
Yeah.
you're still, even if you just said the private set, you still have to set it in something like the constructor, and it's somewhere else. It's on another line. So the real benefit for me is that it makes it more readable because it puts it all in the same line, and it makes it very explicit. I'm creating this, defining this property, and I'm initializing it to this value. It's all right here. Nowhere else. You don't need to look anywhere else to see what the value is going to be when I create this new instance.
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward.
I love this.
Nothing huge about that one. And
I've always been really annoyed when I had to create a backing variable just because I wanted to do something like what you said, the read-only, or just add that like one line of code. If you wanted to like log every time a value was assigned, it's non-functional, right? It's totally just additional information that I want to capture.
To a feature later that I think is closer to what you're saying, because it's not quite the same. The auto property initializer is not quite the same as, like you just said, a property that you might use to just do some quick line of code.
Oh, this is just initializing.
Yeah, this is just initializing, but we'll get to it. So let's do the next easy feature, because then we're going to get into some more complicated ones. So we have had many different ways to format strings. I mean, we've got string.format, and from the beginning we had to put the parameters that we were going to pass. We had to order them and then dial them up 0, 1, 2. And then have you ever run across code where maybe they'll reuse it? So in the string it might be like 0, 1, 1, 2, and then maybe they've gotten out of order.
Yeah.
Yep.
Or to top it all off, they stopped using the second one, and so it's just gone, but yet it's still getting passed.
Yep.
So anyways, we had to deal with that. So we have a new way called string interpolation. It kind of reminded me a little bit of the string literals, where instead of using the @ sign, we're using a $sign, and without getting into what the code looks like, instead of putting 0, 1, 2, and then having to put a list of params at the end, you just actually plop the parameter right into the string, into the braces. You even get IntelliSense with this.
That's amazing. So instead of using string.format and then adding like the curly braces 0, 1, 2, those
building your string out, whatever it is.
Yeah. It's still a placeholder parameter. You're still using those curly braces. Just instead of 0, 1, 2, you're actually using the name of the variable that you want to put there.
Yep.
So there's no like matching up the 0 index to the 0, the first parameter that you're passing into the string format function, or the second one.
It's a little bit closer to like maybe if you just use string concatenation, except without having to do that.
Right. Right. No, I absolutely
a little more readable. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely think this is definitely more readable because string calculation was annoying to me.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, it always scared me, right? It's always for exactly the reason that you just said, Chris. Is like, what if I get this wrong, or what if somebody comes in and kind of like changes the value or the position? It always has bitten me when I add another one. Add or remove one of the indexes and either forget to change the parameters.
How many are there again? What is this? 3?
Yeah. Or what place was this? Because I've gotten into some pretty crazy ones where there's like 3, 4, 5, 6, different placeholders, and you're like, which one is matching up? But I use this feature a lot in JavaScript, in ECMAScript 2015 and in TypeScript. But I'm loving it in C# too.
Yeah.
It definitely is. Definitely think this is the one feature I'd noticed. I'm like, this is the one I definitely want to be using.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's one that I find like already when I head back to a project that for whatever reason has not moved up from 2013. Yeah. I miss this like right away. I go, oh man.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel the same way in the browser too when I'm in like ECMAScript 5 or something like that. But this goes for me a little bit beyond syntactic sugar. Even though it is syntactic sugar, this can actually help you avoid like some pretty serious bugs.
It's interesting because I think what we're identifying here is there's two things that when we've seen features added to the language, sometimes it's a productivity boost. At least that's the idea. Like you might argue that the null conditional stuff, or maybe the using static stuff, was a quote-unquote productivity boost because you typed a little less. But here we're actually saying avoiding errors, which is way better. That's way more value in avoiding errors. Like, wow, this is a feature I want.
Theoretically, you're avoiding errors with the null conditional operator too, but it's you have to have the mindset and the wherewithal to actually put in the null conditional operator to think about the fact that this could be null, in which case if you're already thinking along those lines, then you're probably putting the if then statement in to check for null in the first place.
Right.
Whereas this is literally string.format was the only way to do it before, and now you have a better way, right? This is
Right.
And plus, I mean, when you look at the code like this, after a while, like I said, once you get used to it, it's more readable, right? It's very clear now.
Yep.
In the example we have, first name, last name, ID. Instead of before, you'd have the parentheses 0, 1, then you'd have to go scrolling over to the right to see what was what.
Yeah.
So this is definitely one of the features I think is nice to have.
Well, in one project that I worked on, just like we had an extension for the null conditional operator, that with extension method, we actually had our own kind of formatter, our string formatter, that you could use this same format. It wasn't literally the same, right? It wasn't literally like a drop-in replacement, and it certainly didn't have IntelliSense and stuff, obviously. But instead of using 0, 1, 2 as placeholders, we used the name of the variable. But then you incurred some like reflection cost to actually figure it out. And that reflection cost was worth it to us because of the bugs that you avoided by doing this.
Yeah.
So now you get compiler time.
Yeah.
Runtime.
Yep.
Yeah.
So we were talking a little bit about the auto initialized properties. Probably everybody listening, you're going to have no choice really here but to run out and Google or Bing and say, what is an expression-bodied member?
Yeah.
Right? So that sounds really complicated. Expression-bodied members. But what they are is they are either properties or fields in your class that you basically initialize with a little lambda. So instead of saying, Jess was just talking about, and I think you could do this with this, is you were saying, I want to have some field or property that is just a one-liner. It just goes out and it just logs. And I'm sick and tired of having to have written that out as a full-bodied function. So with an expression-bodied member, you would declare it, and then you use the ANDR symbol, as Scott Hanselman calls it, which is the arrow pointing to the right.
Yes,
and you write the line of code.
Arrow.
Write the line of code. Right, the fat arrow in CoffeeScript, or Douglas Crockford likes to call it the fart operator. So you get funnies from either side, right? Either the Anders operator or
the Anders operator is definitely the official name.
Yeah. So
then for us.
So you can do this with void methods. You can do it with things that return. In a way, it's interesting. It's like saying, like, instead of me building this function or method and then having to go use it in a lambda, well, why don't I just put it all in one?
Yeah.
You can also do it as a property too. You can have expression-bodied member properties that are maybe that good old full name, which concatenates the first name and last name property in some person object. You just bring it all together in a little lambda-looking thing.
Yeah.
Where you say, instead of actually writing out the getter for that property, you just say, well, this is what you'd actually go do.
Yeah. That's awesome.
So yeah, this is kind of cool. I actually have been working in a code base that hadn't used a lot of this, and I can say at first it became very hard to follow what's going on. And I think it's because simply they overused it.
Sure.
I mean, literally I'd step into something, and then from there I would jump to another class, and it would use it there, and I needed to trace through all the code, and trying to trace through all the code, all of a sudden it's just like every time there's this lambda expression. So I would definitely warn people that with any of this stuff, use it where it makes sense to use it, but don't overuse it. You can definitely get carried away, particularly if people aren't using it, or haven't used it before. Missing the return statement, you're like, what's going on? In the code base I'm talking about, what they went even a step further, they actually used the kind of like I call it a JavaScript function pointer. They declared a function, and then somewhere else in the code where the function is. And that doesn't make any sense to me. If I have to scroll around to see where your function is and then look at the code, it's like a level of indirection.
Yeah.
It's like we were talking about before, like logging or something where it's almost self-describing. Like, okay, I'm going to call the logger. Well, that makes sense, right? Or initializing a property. But if you're actually going to need to have a true method with like 10, 15 lines of code, don't just declare your function up top and then you have to let the developer scroll around to find it. So.
Yeah, I think it's definitely meant for those like one-liners that you were right. There's a lot of ceremony to the one-liner of, okay, braces and whatever, where am I going to put it? It's like, well, maybe you could group these. Like, we tend to group our fields and properties at the top of a class. You could group these you could find a nice home for those near the top of the class.
Yeah.
And maybe that would be, I mean, I haven't had enough experience to say yet if I'm going to look back on it and say, oh, this has caused a lot of clutter. But it's interesting. We'll have to see.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
I definitely, again, I think for certain cases it would make sense. But if you're going to have a true method, it's better to have just the method there. Don't have a level of indirection.
Yeah, so that's expression-bodied members. You almost have to look at them to see them. They're like fields and properties that are defined as a lambda-looking thing. To call it a lambda would not be correct, so I won't do that. So let's do an easy one. I actually have been joking that this is the WCF operator. It's called the name of operator, and all it is that if you take this new name of operator and put in parentheses a field, it's going to return a string with that field name minus the reflection. So I notify property changed. Anyone?
Yes, exactly.
So instead of having to go and put strings in there and then, we changed the name of the property, so let's go change the name of the strings everywhere. And people would come up with creative solutions to not have to deal with this. I've seen solutions involving lambdas or maybe centralized files where, we're going to put all of these things so that we'll rely on reflection. And this is saying, like, forget all that. Let's do it at compile time.
Makes sense, right? I mean, that's, again, you're being very explicit what you want to do here. So
another example that I saw was when you throw an argument exception, you often, by convention, or at least the exception itself, is asking you to supply the name of the argument. So what are you going to do? Put that in a string?
Yeah, I mean, that's ultimately what you do.
You use name of and the thing, and so then that way later when you go and do a refactoring and change the name of that identifier, you get that change for free in your exception.
So it's simple. You would get a compile error too, right? If I got rid of contact and called it contact2 or something.
Yeah, like let's say you just have some identifier called, it's called contact and you rename it like you said, but you forget, you weren't using a refactoring tool and you forget to do it here. Well, now it's not an identifier anymore. It's going to blow up.
Yeah. Or if you said it was a string before, the string was just whatever you called it.
Yeah.
So to be very clear, when you mentioned earlier, let's do it at compile time, this is converting down into the string at compile time, the string of the name of the variable or the method or whatever.
Yeah, we probably should have looked at the IL, huh?
Yeah.
All right. We can start talking about code. We're not getting into the IL, all right? We're not moving and popping things.
Yeah, but this is, it's a compile time thing, right? It's not actually like a runtime check that uses reflection to go and convert it to find out what type it is or what the variable is, and then convert it to a string. It actually happens at compile time.
Yeah. With
no runtime overhead.
And if it works that way, then it's really super awesome and helpful.
We're not 100% sure.
Right. I just want to make it clear that we did not double check on that one. At least I didn't.
Neither.
I'm willing to put money down on that's how it works.
Yeah, I'd like to think that's how it works. It makes too much sense, right?
It wouldn't be much useful if it didn't work that way.
Yeah.
So here's a super simple one, and it's a pop quiz for everyone if you didn't know already, is that when you decide to jump into the world of async and await, and you mark a method with the async keyword, and then you await awaitable methods, you cannot use await in catch or finally blocks until C#6. And, if you've decided to really take advantage of it, that can be annoying to say, we're doing all of this I/O, and we're doing it asynchronously. Oh, but wait, if I want to log in a catch block, I can't do it that way.
Yeah.
So
but the real description for this is you couldn't do it before, and now you can.
And now you can do what you thought you probably could have done.
Right.
The first time you tried it, and then it didn't work.
This is the thing you tried to do, and you're why isn't it there?
And then moved on, and
you don't do that anymore.
Now you get stuff.
All right, now here's something that I actually thought was kind of a neat idea, and I've even seen some places in code that I said, this could be useful, is exception filters. And so this is adding a when, and I believe it's actually a keyword, a when, but I think it's one of C#'s famous context-sensitive keywords. So a when keyword that comes after a catch declaration. So you're saying you got some try block, and in your catch you're saying I'm going to catch a file not found exception. That's what I'm going to catch. Well, now you're catching them all. But the reality is how many times have you written a catch block and you actually are really only going to take an action in a certain case of the exception, and the rest of the time you're just going to rethrow. I mean, that actually has happened to me a lot in SQL exceptions. There are specific ones that we're going to take specific action on. In fact, just it could be like we're going to check to see if it's a deadlock exception and do something, versus whether it was something else that we didn't really think about what to do here, so let's just rethrow it. So using this when, you get to put a little conditional, and now the catch block only fires when the conditional is met. So in my case, I would have said catch SQL exception when, and since let's just say that it was catch SQL exception EX, so now I've said that the SQL exception is going to be identified as EX. I can go dot into the EX, check out the error I was looking for. Oh wait, it is that deadlock error that we're interested in, that we have some logic to handle. Let me deal with it. Otherwise, I don't want to write any code. I don't want to even if and figure out what to do.
Yeah, I mean, you'd almost start writing case statements and if conditions in your catch block.
Yeah, right.
Which
right.
is
Or it just leads
to the road to hell.
You're just letting it fall through to the final catch-all exception if you have one. Yeah, I found myself using this when I was doing. I forget, it was last year. Sometimes I was doing some HTTP request. I forget exactly what the class was, but I would any error that came back, it would go into a catch block, and all I could catch is that specific error, that HTTP exception error or something like that, right? And all I really wanted to catch was if the HTTP exception error was this response code. So it would throw an exception for a whole bunch of response codes, but I wanted to go and filter down and say, well, if it's these 3 response codes, then that's not actually really an exception in my case, right? That's like a quote valid response code. I mean, it's it's an error, but it's something that I actually have logic to handle. Whereas if it's any other response code, then that's not something I'm handling. That's a valid quote exception. That's an exceptional case that I wasn't really prepared to handle. So let that flow through either to my default exception handler, right, my more generalized one, or just let it bubble up.
Yeah, you definitely, what you described there is definitely, when you're dealing with HTTP requests,
Yeah.
that's definitely somewhere I could see you. Having something like this would definitely be useful.
Yeah, that one has potential. I like the idea of cutting out branching code. Just like you said, the if check, we've said it a few times, is the if check that's kind of unneeded, and it's really just noise in the code when you can a little more declaratively say, hey, I want this exception, but in this case, otherwise don't bother me with it.
Well, my problem has been like, once you get into the catch, what do you do then? If you realize that once you've gotten in there that you can't handle it, then what? You rethrow? Like you can't just bubble down into the next one.
Yeah, you add complicated logic. Yeah, you can get carried away.
Right. Well, in this case, I had to write logic. I actually extracted it into a different method, but had I put it all in line, it would have been like 40 lines long of conditional catch logic, right?
Yeah.
When all I was really doing, I should have had just 2 or 3 or 4 different catches with these when conditions on them to say when the response code is this, then do this. When the response code is this, otherwise just let it go.
Yeah.
And you make a really good point about catch blocks that I think sometimes goes, it's so easy to just create them, like, oh, let me just throw a try catch around this. When you have entered a catch block, you've now committed yourself, if you want your code to work anyways, you've committed yourself to now dealing with it.
Yeah.
And
the very last thing you want to do is rethrow another rethrow another kind of exception.
You've pretty much said, you've said to the code, I'm going to deal with it, because not only that, there's a finally block, hopefully, coming up afterwards.
Yep.
Because we probably, as developers, don't finally enough, and we should see a lot more try finally in our code and a lot less try catch. And look, I'm guilty, but I try to think of it that way, is I want to see a lot more of that.
Well, that's a whole other discussion around where do you put try catch.
That's like an exception show, right?
Yeah, we had an hour on nulls. Why not an hour on exceptions?
So there's one more that I skipped over, and the reason why was because I think we would deal with it pretty quickly. They're called dictionary initializers. We've always had some code, the ability to create a dictionary and to go ahead and create the items right in there, and we can even, attach their keys and their values. And it's just a little bit of like slightly different syntax to declare the keys. That's what I'm getting out of this. And I looked at it and I said, okay. I wasn't even 100% sure that it was that much cleaner. I mean, I don't hate it. It's a couple less curly brackets, but I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I think this is one of those ones where like we're really not going to be able to explain this.
Oh no, you have to go look at
it. You got to look at it. But honestly, personally, for me, I would say don't even bother going and looking at it. It's a feature that's there, and one of your teammates might use it, so you should probably be familiar with it. But like, I just don't see how this is even considered syntactic sugar. It's just a different syntax. I don't see what it buys you. I don't.
Instead of equals, you have a few less curly brackets, right? You end up with
that's all it is.
So
I don't think you would be confused by it though. Like if you ran across it without explanation.
Yeah, right.
Sure. Like, I don't know what happened here, which is at least good.
Yeah.
Compared to the alternative of like what? Which certainly the first time many developers saw LINQ or lambdas, I mean it was timeout. What is going on? What did you do? What's wrong with you? I hate you.
Yeah.
Or how many conversations did you have about, oh, wait, now that you're using var, that means it's dynamic. No. It is not dynamic.
var, that's definitely the one that throws people off.
Yeah.
What LINQ? I just last month had an issue with a LINQ statement because developers still don't necessarily understand that it's actually an evaluated expression, that it may be evaluated later, not right there when you're you are defining it, right? So it has a functional effect on your code. This doesn't really, at least I assume it doesn't.
So I definitely can say of all these things that they're all, I think, pretty interesting and pretty useful, but definitely the Andres character, the function direction is something that's, if you're not expecting it and all of a sudden you start reading code, you're like, what the heck's going on? Yeah. And you can kind of figure it out if you use the LINQ enough, but it definitely is one of those things that it can throw you off.
Looks like you're looking at a CoffeeScript file.
Well, no, it was funny. It's like, hey, I feel like I'm running JavaScript now. I'm returning to a function.
Well, that operator is making its way into. It's made its way into Java. It's made its way into JavaScript. And again, CoffeeScript has both the fat and thin arrow, where I'm pretty sure
that's gonna really confuse people.
Well, and there's a reason for it, which I cannot. I'm not going to be able to explain right now because I don't even know it. It's one of those things where when you explain it to me, I'll be like, oh yeah, that's what it was, but I don't know right now. Java has it. JavaScript has it now. I mean, that syntax has infected everything.
Yeah. You said even C++, I think added. I can't remember which version, but
yes,
the one they added a couple years ago, 2013, I think it might have been, or 15 or something. I came across. I'm like, oh, they're putting a lot of C# stuff into C++.
Well, as long as they all mean roughly the same thing. I mean, if you start using different the same operator for different things,
we all get confused very quickly. So
you mean like the CNC out stuff?
So one thing we talked about in the pre-show, we didn't talk about now, is when people go out and start looking to find out what's happening in C#6 or anything really nowadays, is make sure you're getting the latest information, right? Because we all Googled and we found 3 or 4 different things that we weren't sure if were got released or not released. It's very important to, and like we did this a little bit in the pre-show, actually try stuff out. Just don't blindly take something that's written on the internet as, oh, it's in here now, great, I can use it. No, you really need to actually verify it yourself.
Yeah, beware a little bit with C#6 would be my advice, because you will Google and you will find MSDN articles, and guess what? Some of features got cut. Yeah. A feature we were all looking forward to, which was called default constructors, right? Well, basically the idea was that you could create structs without a default constructor, and it got cut. And then there were other features about constructor-isms that got cut. Like there's one called primary constructors and explicit constructors, and they were cut. So you might read some very passionate articles that were written even in the 2014, 2015 timeframe, early 2015 timeframe, talking about how great it's going to be to have IEnumerable params, and then go try them, and you will not be happy.
You're wasting your time. So, well, it's even like we said in the beginning that in order to use C#6, you need 2015. A lot of articles you find will say, "Hey, just download the NuGet package and the thing for Roslyn, and all of a sudden now you can use it. Well, no, actually, the supported way of doing it, you need 2015. So
Yeah.
there's lots of
Well,
miscommunication.
2015 is free, right? There's several free full versions of 2015. There's the community edition now, so there's really no excuse to not use it. I say that, whereas at work we're still on 2013.
Yeah. Hey,
Well,
you
even
know what?
code, right? Even in Visual Studio Code, you can do C# code, right? So
That's not unusual for, I mean, plenty of folks listening right now, or even, teams that I am on are on VS 2013. In fact, how many people listening right now are saying, what are you, 2013? Man, we're still using 2010. That's not unusual.
Yeah.
I've come across somebody that was using 2005, I guess. I think they were at 2. They were at .NET 2.0.
Yeah. Well, and that's a different problem altogether, because obviously if 2 out of the 3 of us are still using it and Todd still comes across it, then clearly we don't have an answer for how to fix that problem.
No, I mean, I would tell people same thing I tell people about when talk about versions of web browsers. The days of you pick a web browser, or you pick whatever software and you stick with it for 5 years, those days are over.
Yeah.
You really need to. You're in the world we live in today with security and a bunch of other things. A year, 2 years max really is where you should be adopting.
Yeah.
The idea that somebody in the ivory tower picks a version of .NET or IE version and you stick with it forever is just it's counterproductive.
Well, yeah. For me, the thing is that in almost all cases, I'm hesitant to say all cases, but I believe it might be all cases. If you're using a paid version of Visual Studio, you actually have a license for MSDN that comes across with that. Is that just completely false? I mean, are you
as
guys...
far as I know, if you have
almost
TFS,
always right.
Almost always, yeah. So if you're using Visual Studio, a full-fledged version of Visual Studio, you have access to 2015 from a legal standpoint.
I can tell you, I know of some organizations personally that they went out and bought the boxed Visual Studio Professional.
Yeah.
And when you buy that box, you're not buying. I'm not saying MSDN with Visual Studio Professional. I'm saying Visual Studio Professional. Then that sticks you to that license.
Yeah.
I keep hearing like that license might be disappearing, but I'm not sure. I don't really.
Certainly, my understanding has always been if you have a TFS license, you need an MSDN license to get TFS. So you're paying the thousands of dollars for it. You should be using the latest stuff.
Yeah. Right. If you've got Visual Studio on your machine and you're checking code into a TFS version and you have more than like 5 people on your team and you're not using all the community stuff or the BizSpark stuff or even BizSpark is you got MSDN licenses.
Yeah. Or using TFS Online or something. If you're internally, then you pretty much, as far as I understand, you definitely have the license of 2015.
Yeah. So it just becomes the matter of internal policy and politics and.
The normal everyday things to deal with.
Yeah.
So you're saying is you cannot use all these new fancy things, so you're stuck on 2013 is what you're saying.
I am saying that at work, at least for the the existing projects that we have. If there are a few of us, and I have to admit, maybe I shouldn't be publicly admitting this, but I'm running 2015 on my machine that I installed subversively. But I mean, officially, we can't be using this on our team, which means we can't be using C# 6, which means that I've still got code where I'm using my .with extension method instead of the Elvis operator.
So, tight little tangent here. Something that I thought was kind of interesting. We're talking about versioning and thing. Is the fact that Microsoft seems to be pushing the idea of getting people to the latest versions of stuff, like .NET. I think it's 4.6, 4.5.1.2 or something is the only really supported stuff anymore.
Oh gosh, I think, man, we're going to get this totally wrong, but I think that as part of pushing 4.6.2 out the door, they said 4.5.1 is not supported, and wow, those aren't the kind of things you're hearing, right?
Yeah.
They're like, but 3.5 was still supported. There was some weird combination.
You want to be on the point release of 4.5, which I think is 4.5.2. Okay.
Yeah,
but not on that 4.5. Get that 4.5.1 out of here. And I think some of it is an attempt to try and reduce some of the surface area that they've been dealing with. They want to push stuff out faster. That's great. That makes some folks very happy. But that also means, man, they might have 8 versions of something out in the wild. And that doesn't just go for .NET.
Yeah, no, I mean, pretty much ASP.NET is a new version every quarter, right? So
that's what that team wants to do, yeah.
And then they add .NET Core.
Yeah,
let's just create a whole new version of the same framework.
because no one has it, right? So they can easily update it all the time, and it's open source, right? So
Yeah, it's open source. It's your problem.
exactly. So it's which version is it then? It's whatever version you forked.
Yeah.
Telling you,
with
Shazam.
C-sharp, right? So yeah,
C# podcast
6.
Shazam version.
Yeah, exactly.
C# 6 really felt to me like this is totally me guessing, right? Is we need to dog food Roslyn and all of our capability, so let's add some features in and we'll light them up in the IDE so that they help people out. And because C# 7 proposals, this is going to feel more like a major release again. Look, nothing is final. It's being done totally in the open. We'll try and get a link up to show you where you can look at this stuff right on the GitHub repo and can contribute if you want to talk about it. But we're talking about bringing what looks to me like a lot of functional constructs to C#.
Yeah.
So,
well, starting with LINQ, right? LINQ is a very functional feature.
It is, but like C# 7 is talking about bringing in algebraic data types and pattern matching. And it's like, hey, this is what the F# folks are standing out there yelling at us about. So interesting. I'm not definitely ready to speak about it, but interesting to see like, hey, is this, and why is the language moving in this direction? Like, what is it about C#? Is it just because we have to iterate? Like, what's the future of C#? Especially in a world that there's this whole world out there that wants everything to be JavaScript, right? So what's the future of C#?
Yeah.
So I find it interesting when we talk a lot about C# becoming functional, right? I mean, you can almost see it over the years it's become more and more functional. And recently I had sort of an epiphany about that. And it was because somebody wanted to still use VB.NET for stuff. And I'm like, is the reason why they're bringing a lot of the F# type stuff into C# is that they'll get more adoption? Because if you tell people, like, okay, C# is here, it does what it does, now start using F# for these other things, or Scala, or whatever else, developers are very married to their language, right? I'm a C# developer. That's how you almost describe yourself. And so I had this epiphany that maybe that's part of the reason why they keep adding more and more stuff. And the fact, really, what else can they add? There's not much more. I mean, there's only so much more synthetic sugar you can add. That maybe part of the idea is they want developers to start using these practices. Async await's another good example. But they realize that if you tell developers to switch languages, there's a level of barrier, right? Even going for JavaScript, I'm still having people tell me, like, I don't want to learn JavaScript. You've done it for years. No, I don't want to learn it, though. I just want to do my normal web form stuff. So I definitely think that's, at least in my opinion, is that's some of the driver behind that. They realize if they start putting more and more stuff into C#, it will get more adoption versus telling people to switch languages for different things. Again, that's just my opinion.
Right.
So the big thing for me is that you just mentioned that it's on GitHub, right? So does this mean that C# is open source now? I mean, it's always been an open spec, the C# spec. It has another name, ECMAScript something. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's got a big long official ECMAScript name.
But it is ECMA.
ECMA, right? Not ECMAScript, right? ECMA. It's an ECMA
standardized. But
yeah. And for a long time, Visual C++, Visual C#, which was actually the original name, didn't quite comply into the spec.
The official spec, yeah. Well, and then I'm not really sure. There's only been a couple other compilers other than Microsoft's, and
Mono was obviously one.
Yeah, Mono is basically the only one. I mean, there's been a couple, but they've been more like research projects, basically, not actually used.
And now we have Core.NET.
Well, now we have Core.NET, but that's built on Roslyn too. Right?
Yes.
So now there's Roslyn. So to be specific, to be clear, what you mentioned earlier, the GitHub site is the Roslyn GitHub site.
Right.
So
yes,
if you have an issue,
Roslyn.
Yeah, if you have an issue or a comment on C# or even now VB, because that's what Roslyn supports is both of those, you go to the Roslyn site and you just and that's where they're having these discussions of what's up next in C# 7. They're having it on the Roslyn GitHub site.
That's right.
Which is interesting. It's not necessarily what you'd expect.
Yep, and the official explanation is Roslyn provides open source C# and Visual Basic compilers with rich code analysis APIs, and that's important. Like, it's easy to get lost in one or the other and say, oh, well, Roslyn is the compiler. Yes, but it's also the code analysis APIs. I mean, that was the whole point, was to marry these two things. So, and it's okay to talk about one or the other, like nobody's going to come and arrest you, but the platform is both. It isn't just, we rebuilt C#. Yeah, it was we rebuilt C# this way because we wanted code analysis. That's
Yeah.
Microsoft speaking there.
Well, and I saw a
So-
talk. Todd and I actually saw a talk way back at PDC. I think it was '08, where
Yeah.
Anders got up in stage and announced this compiler as a service,
Right.
where
Yep.
you can go in and call a service to say, here's a chunk of text that is C# code. Go compile it, run it, and tell me what the result is, and actually kind of integrate with it.
Right.
And you can do this. You could have done this before, right? You can do this before Rosalind with the code DOM, and I've done that
Mhm.
before. Basically, use reflection to build code and execute code.
That's really
This
complicated, though.
it's really complicated. Yeah, you got to like understand code DOM, and it's insane. I still can't believe to this day that I actually did it, because I definitely could not go and write it today, even though I did dozens of hours, hundreds of hours of it before, because it is so complicated. But this allows you to just write C# code and just say, hey, go run this, right? And let me know.
Well, I mean, if you take a look at like ASP.NET Core, right, it's taking advantage of a lot of stuff. We have the project.json file, and you're typing your code. Rosalind's always running now. It's taking advantage of it's doing things for you. So that definitely is. I mean, think about the old days, old days, right? What did you have to do? You build your project, set up your make file. We're talking about old days. Then you hit compile, and you wait 30 minutes, and you got code, and then you try to run it. Now we live in a world of almost instantaneous gratification.
Well, you just described my JavaScript build chain.
Right.
Yeah, well,
Hit save and it just restarts,
JavaScript, we don't quite have Rosalind yet for JavaScript. Maybe
restarts your
someday.
browser, restarts your server.
I mean, really, I mean, would any of us be surprised if Visual Studio 2018 JavaScript is a full-fledged language again? I mean, there was a JScript.NET code at one point. No one ever used it, but technically you could have always written .NET with JavaScript. So,
Yeah. Well,
Or
one
JavaScript.
thing I definitely want to do is I want to thank Steve Migliotti, who's a ASP.NET MVP. And the reason why I want to thank him is, first of all, he came up to Philly.NET and to talk about C# 6, which helped me gather a lot of notes. That was awesome, so thank you, Steve. But also, we're going to include his link to his slide and code, because he gives this presentation kind of up and down the East Coast. He's based out of the DC/Virginia area. He's a good friend to a lot of us in this area. So, the thing that was great about it is we talked about how difficult it was to find definitive documentation that was not just correct, but like came up high in searches. And you looked at Steve's stuff and said, wow, he put this all in one place. It's all in one spot. Here's the list.
Yep.
And let's just look through it with code samples. Oh, wow, great.
Yep.
So, but that's
Really
Steve.
great.
I mean, he's a great speaker. If you're ever at a conference and you see his name, go see the talk.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. And don't be surprised if you hear him on the show. That's
that would be the plan. Do you know if he's giving that at Philly.net? Is he giving that talk?
He did give it at Philly.net
I
just
meant
a
Code
couple
Camp.
months ago.
I think there is a
Oh,
Code Camp.
at Code Camp. I'm not sure if I saw
I'm
him.
trying to bring it up there. The site, it's a little slow today. But I thought for sure there was a C# 6.
Actually, that's right. You know what it is he was doing so Philly.net has Friday full day workshops, and he's going to just basically give you the full rundown of C#. So it's not just C# 6. It's, hey, come get better at C#, which
It's a journey through C#.
yes, yeah. And look, there's the person to do it. I remember a few years ago he came and introduced C# 4 to Philly.net. So I mean, he's got a history of being on the leading edge of what's happening in the language.
Yeah. Nice.
So appreciate that.
So I wanted to jump back real quick to you'd mentioned Rosalind and bringing code analysis into Visual Studio, and this is something that you and I have talked about, and I want to bring it up on the podcast because maybe now we have a little bit more of an audience. You know exactly where I'm going with this.
Yeah.
We have talked about making an open source ReSharper built on top of Rosalind.
Right.
And the reason we've talked about this, and Microsoft folks themselves, Chris, you mentioned you talked to a couple of people at Microsoft who basically said, yeah, go do it, is that they've already given all the framework. So the difficult part of ReSharper, the product, is just like all the wiring and everything that you got to wire into Visual Studio. Rosalind gives you all of that. Visual Studio 2015 gives you all of that. It's just waiting to be extended. Heck, even the new project templates literally have I don't know what the folder's called. I think it's called like extensions or compiler extensions or something. It's just there waiting, begging to be used. And the only thing to do is use it. And so we've talked about building a library of just kind of shared open source library of shared refactorings that basically just re-implement the features of ReSharper.
Right.
And it's just never gone anywhere because, you and I haven't really done anything with it, but we also don't want to do it just ourselves. And so I'm going to say right now, we can build that GitHub repository. We can put it in the show notes, and I'm stating a call to action to the Static Void podcast listeners to come on and join us and start writing some refactorings, and we can kick this project off here.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if it would be useful to a lot of people to say, I mean, especially if you have an organization that says, oh yeah, we get you the compilers, but we don't get you any tools. I mean, that's an epidemic as well. We could probably do a whole show on that.
Yeah.
So,
well, my current problem is that ReSharper in particular, I have the license. I bought the license, but the thing is just so slow.
Well, yeah, that happens to a lot of folks. It's starting to bog you down. So you go up and you hit suspend regularly, right? Because you want to get some work done.
Yeah. Well, and specifically, to be fair to ReSharper, it's not necessarily ReSharper that's slow. It's that I only have like 4 gigs of RAM on this virtual machine that I'm developing in. Yeah. And so honestly, I don't even know if the resharpening Roslyn refactorings would help me with that. But
it's not a 16 gig machine, huh?
Worth a shot. Well, it's out of my control.
But isn't that that's an interesting topic, right? Is things out of developers' control help developers get their job done faster?
Yeah, man. Sounds like a great episode.
Yes. Save it for that one.
And I think that's it for this one. Sounds like that's the show. So you, listener, what do you think? Have you used C# 6? If so, what's your take on it? Has it helped you Has it helped you write cleaner, better code, or has it even affected you at all? Have you used it and just nothing has changed?
We'd love to know. 2013.
Yeah, right.
Or are you still using 2010?
Or 2005.
So we would love to know.
Comment.
Yes, please leave us a comment on the website, staticvoidpodcast.com, or send an email to comments@staticvoidpodcast.com. And as always, if you have a topic you'd like us to discuss on the show, please feel free to let us know through those same channels. We want to make sure that we're talking about the things that you actually want to hear about. So Todd, Chris, thanks for the chat.
Yep.
Nice. Thank you.
And thank you, listener, for spending the time with us. We hope that you enjoyed it, and we look forward to seeing you next time on the Static Void Podcast. You did it this time.
I was trying to remember how we did it. I know we used to do something. Stop recording, right?
All right, yes. Stop recording. Save it. Send it to me, and I'm going to see if I'm going to freaking blow up tonight because we're out of sync. All right, start a new folder here. I guess we can stop broadcasting. We'll leave it running.
People were entertained.
So here's the thing. So build this week. Is there a build reaction?
Does anyone care about build?
I don't know. Depends on what happens.
I'm not sure I'm going to react to build.
I saw that on the.
That's fair.
The ISPNet stand-up meeting thing. They're like, yeah, we're not going to have a full version ready yet for build. We'll have something.
Oh yeah. They're not.
I didn't watch I saw the webpage, or I saw what do you call it? Blog post about it. Fritz's blog post about it, and there were some interesting comments in there about people having concerns and.
Right. Well, I think a lot of people assumed, well, obviously they're going to be ready for build, but the fact of the matter is they are actually replatforming on .dot.net and not DNX, and that just isn't.
It wasn't file, right? Yes.
It wasn't like they've just been holding it.
No, you can send me the OGG. That's what Rishi said.
Wait, what do you want?
Export it as
OGG Vorbis.
Yeah.
I don't see it here as a choice.
What do you like? Why do you like OGG Vorbis?
It's compressed. It's lossless compression.
Okay.
Which option? I don't see it here. I see AFF.
It's just OGG Vorbis is what it's called.
I don't see it here.
Really? It's not
I
there.
don't see it. I see.
Or maybe it's FLAC. Hold on. Maybe it's FLAC.
FLAC, I see.
Yeah. Hold on. Which one was it? LAC. Free lossless audio codec. Yeah, use FLAC.
FLAC. I never heard of FLAC before. Okay.
Lossless compression. That's what you're looking for. OGG Vorbis. That's like an MP3 competitor. It's a patent-free audio compression format. Yeah. That's not lossless.
I mean, that's all MP3 is and stuff. It's just a compression format.
Yeah. But it's lossy.
Yeah.
It drops. The way it compresses is that it drops.
Especially 3. Remember, so.
Yeah.
A long time since I
FLAC
did
is lossless.
Back in a past life, I actually had some knowledge of that stuff.
What?
Oh, like how all those files were set up. This is years ago, back when I worked at a multimedia company. We used to have to like understand how that shit worked. And MPEG was new back then.
Yeah,
We're talking
put a
1998
copyright on
or
it.
96 or something.
All right, I'm going to stop broadcasting.
That sounds
Thanks
a good idea.
everybody who's watching on YouTube's.